Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Protecting Stark's Future webinar this morning. This webinar is presented in partnership with the Stark Community Foundation, United Way of Greater Stark County, and the Center for Community Solutions. My name is Danny Carlson. I am the Communications Director for the Center for Community Solutions, and I'll be introducing our speakers today and then moderating your questions at the end. So I did just want to go over a few things. We've already received a question from the chat. All of the attendees are automatically muted and your cameras are automatically turned off. So feel free not to worry about that as we go through today's webinar. The purpose of which I wanted to just kind of go over what you are going to hear today from our presenters. We plan to highlight the new data-driven Protecting Stark's Future report and announce a new funding cycle at the end to support child poverty reduction plans. So this is the welcome and agenda review. We are in it right now. And then we are going to toss things over to Maria from United Way of Greater Stark County and Mark from the Stark County Community Foundation. Then we will toss it over to my colleague, Emily Campbell, who will talk about the Protecting Stark's Future report. We will have some Q&A from you after that. And then at the end, Amy Krebs from the Stark Community Foundation will be going over what the next steps are and the RFP process. So I did want to let everyone know we will be monitoring questions. Please feel free to type them in the chat or type them in the Q&A portion. I will monitor those and we'll ask those at the end of the presentation, just so we make sure that everyone is able to get through everything that they're planning to share with you this morning. But please feel free to share those throughout if things pop up. And I believe with that, I am going to toss things over to Maria, who is going to give us a quick introduction. Maria?
Thank you, Danny. Good morning, everyone. I wish we were meeting over coffee and a Danish of choice, but I'm glad we can all be together this morning. I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about the significance of data. Data collection is an important element when making improvements because without it, there's a lack of evidence that problems exist. It can change the ways in which we work and can provide better outcomes for those who receive care and support. Data collection can be used to paint a picture of the current state and provide insight into current issues and hone in on where improvements should focus. It can help us define needs, set goals, plan interventions, and evaluate progress. Every time data is collected, collated, analyzed, and processed, presented or shared, it should be for the benefit of the people we support, not just for the sake of collecting data. Data can drive community change and awareness. To share a little history with you, in the early 2000s, United Way in participation with local foundations brought Compass to Stark County. The purpose of Compass was to assess the needs in the community, identify community resources to address the most urgent needs, and encourage action to address the needs. The first Compass report and needs assessment process was conducted in 2002. An updated report was then generated every 3 years. The Compass Needs Assessment involved 3 steps: gathering information about needs, reviewing and prioritizing the needs, and then documenting the results. Reviewing and processing needs included developing data-focused presentations that were shared at the county and regional level. 8 committees comprised of volunteers from social services, government, business, education, civic, and religious representation. And some of you are with us today. We looked in areas such as community development, community living, economics, education, environment, families and households, health, and public safety. And through those 8 focus groups, programs, initiatives, and collaborations were developed. For example, the agency Access Health percolated out of the Health Subcommittee. In 2008, tough economic times resulted in United Way suspending Compass and reallocating those dollars to the Emergency Assistance Collaborative, still in place today. And since that time, United Way, foundations, local leaderships still are being asked for data and information. And that's why we were so excited when the Stark Community Foundation and United Way, in partnership with the Center for Community Solutions, came together last year to share the 2019 Stark County Community Assessment Report. For those of you who may not be aware, the report's a comprehensive data report. The assessment pulls together in one place, that's what's key, in one place, the most timely, relevant data on health, social, and economic conditions in Stark County. The assessment is not meant to be an exhaustive compilation of all data on Stark County, but rather a correlated set of data to inform decision-making. The data sheds lights on a variety of community conditions, including demographics, family, households, and neighborhoods, education, economics, environment, and health. The report continues to play a key role in community conversations and funding decisions. And to provide an update to that report, it is my pleasure to turn over to Mark Samolczak, President and CEO of Stark Community Foundation.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning to everyone that's joining us. Happy to have you here with us because I think you will shortly hear some very, I'll call it sobering, but very much needed data that Emily Campbell will be sharing with us. I should point out before I turn it over to Emily, just a couple comments in terms of how we have arrived at where we're at today. The idea for this white paper really began almost 3.5 years ago in the summer of 2017. In August of that year, we published Strengthening Stark. As Maria said, data is so critical to making good choices, and Strengthening Stark was a data-driven analysis of Stark County's economic infrastructure. The conclusion that we reached after we looked at all of the data points was that if we continued to pursue economic development processes and policies as we had in the past, that we would continue down the path that we were on as a community, which was a path that I'm certain none of us really wanted to be walking down. And that was a path that was leading us in the direction of becoming older as a community, becoming smaller as a community, and becoming poorer or less affluent as a community. So that report, Strengthening Stark, was very much a call to action. It started out as an initiative. It has become a movement across the county. I'm very pleased to see the progress that is being made across the county in all geographic areas. And the purpose of that report was to set the stage for creating a growing economy with good jobs and rising incomes for everyone. But we also knew when we published Strengthening Stark that that was only part of the story. The other component of a healthy community is the social infrastructure, or what we call the social fabric of Stark County. And thus we have a companion piece to Strengthening Stark, which is Protecting Stark's Future, which was just released a couple days ago. Again, it's a data-driven analysis of the social fabric of Stark County. And we believe that when you merge the two, you read Strengthening Stark and then its companion piece, Protecting Stark's Future, you will see that we have a blueprint for action, another, let's say, another call to action. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily Campbell, who, along with her colleagues, really, as well as several of my colleagues here at Stark Community Foundation, Callie Livengood and Amy Krebs, are the authors of this white paper. And Emily is going to lead us through some of the more critical findings from that white paper. Emily, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mark. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us this morning. We are so excited to be sharing this information with you. Now, I've already seen in the chat a couple of questions about whether this information will be available after the webinar. It will be. It will be posted on Stark Community Foundation's website, and we do have that link at the end of the presentation. Oh, and there you go. Danny's pulling it up already. So as I go through, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll have time for that in a bit, and the information will be available after this presentation. What I'd like to do is provide some highlights of the report and some of the thinking that's behind it, behind kind of how we ended up here and why child poverty and why now. So the next slide is a little bit of information about the organization that I work for, the Center for Community Solutions. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think tank. Our offices are in Cleveland and Columbus, and we've been around for more than 100 years, working to improve health, social, and economic conditions. And so this type of data-driven examination of community issues and thinking about what are those policy levers or philanthropic levers or community levers that can be pushed in order to improve community conditions is really where our focus lies. And so I've been delighted to be working with these great partners in Stark County, the Stark Community Foundation and United Way of Greater Stark County for the last couple of years, kind of carrying on that tradition of the Compass Report, thinking about the social fabric that was a bit missing from the Strengthening Stark white paper, and finding ways that the community can hopefully move forward to avoid being older, smaller, and we think most importantly, poorer. So a couple things happened last fall that really spurred us to action and felt like child poverty is what we really need to be focusing on. As Maria mentioned, we released the Stark County Community Assessment, which was kind of the raw data, the background information, and we had always intended to take a deeper dive and do some more analysis about issues that are truly critical to the future of Stark County. The second thing that happened was that in September of last year, the US Census Bureau released data that puts Canton, Ohio at the very bottom of the list in child poverty. So the worst child poverty rate of any city in the United States with a population over 65,000. Now this came as a bit of a shock. Frankly, I was surprised that Canton was so far down on the list and served as a bit of a wake-up call. I know there were a lot of conversations about what does this data really mean? How is it collected? What does it mean for our community? And how can we move forward? At the same time, the Strengthening Stark work was starting to delve even deeper into issues of geography, of place, and starting to look at some of the barriers to employment that might be preventing people from being able to take advantage of economic development and workforce development activities that were taking place. So things like which neighborhoods have good access to childcare so that parents are able to take advantage of jobs that may be available, and which neighborhoods have a lack of those things, and what impact does it have on people living in those communities? So again, Strengthening Stark talked about avoiding a future where Stark County is smaller, older, and poorer. And as we went through our discernment process and continued to work on the white paper, we realized that every issue of concern in Stark County is either a cause or a consequence of poverty. And that child poverty in particular, all over the county, but especially in Canton, is at crisis levels. So we focused our analysis, our conversation, and our attention. And so the report released this week examines child poverty in Stark County in depth, including those issues that are associated with poverty. And it lays out a clear path forward. Here you can see a bit of a summary of what the report itself hopes to do. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about the issues underlying that social fabric, some of the data and information. The white paper itself lays out a very clear argument and the case for a coordinated approach to address child poverty, and specifically 7 recommendations to address child poverty and ways to move forward that I'll talk about more in a moment. We included data and information relating to the need for urgent action, to addressing immediate needs while increasing the earnings of families, to breaking cycles of poverty, and the resources and action required. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what do we really mean by poverty? So the poverty data that we rely on comes from the US Census Bureau. It is the official poverty measure for the United States. And here on your screen, you see the official poverty income guidelines that come from the federal government. These are the levels of household income that we mean when we talk about someone being at 100% of the federal poverty level. These are often used to determine eligibility for public programs and even a lot of other services in the community. In Stark County, 14% of people lived in poverty before COVID-19. That's about 1 out of every 7 residents in your county, but it's not spread evenly. There are pockets of poverty in every community in Stark County, but the larger cities in your county tend to have higher poverty rates. And it's also not spread evenly among various racial and ethnic groups. We certainly see some racial disparities when we look at poverty in Stark County. And in Stark County and across the state, the younger you are, the more likely you are to live in poverty. Whether or not you live in poverty is entirely determined by your household income. So how much earnings, how much income your family as a whole brings in determines whether or not someone is living in poverty. The next slide shows that in Canton in particular, child poverty is at crisis levels. So I showed you the data that was released last fall. This is the data that was released just a few months ago in September 2020. And Canton, although the poverty rate increased a bit year over year, other places rose faster. So that today Canton sits at second worst on this list, tied with Youngstown, Ohio. But why do we care in particular about child poverty, especially if our children aren't living in poverty? Well, time and time again, the data shows us that poverty costs us all. By age 4, poor children have heard 30 million fewer words than their better off peers. Poor children are more likely to be hungry and less likely to have affordable quality health coverage, which can have a lifetime of impacts. Poor children are less likely to graduate from high school. Child poverty increases the risk of unemployment and adult poverty. And poverty has been linked to just about every negative community condition in the social fabric that you can imagine. From preterm birth, from teen births, all the way through much higher costs in the healthcare system, as well as being more likely to perpetrate or be the victim of a crime. If we go to the next slide, you can see the targets for a child poverty reduction plan for Stark County. And you will see this graphic again a little bit later because it's really important. Usually efforts to address child poverty take one of 2 approaches. Either they work to help kids overcome their disadvantages. So think of things like high quality early care and education to make sure that kids from poor families are ready to start kindergarten. Or they work with families and parents to increase family stability and increase earnings and wages. So kind of getting the family out of poverty right now. So working with kids to overcome their disadvantages can be extraordinarily effective, but it takes a long time for a community to really see the results of those efforts. Usually an entire generation when the children of today become the adults of tomorrow. Working with parents to improve family stability and increase earnings is a much faster way to move up on those lists and to improve child poverty. Because again, poor children come from poor families, and whether they are poor is determined by the income of their parents. Stark has the resources available and in place to be able to do both simultaneously. So work on issues that are occurring right now while continuing to look for the future so that in 20 years, we don't find ourselves in the same position. The community cannot wait for the next generation. One study found that every $1 invested in reducing child poverty would save $7 in economic costs because of lower crime, higher tax revenues, and better health. But there are thousands of people living in poverty right now. The next slide, we begin to think about addressing those immediate needs. There is a general consensus that those official poverty thresholds do not actually mean that a family is able to get by, and that the amount of money that a family would need to be able to meet their basic needs without assistance from government or philanthropy and charity or friends and family is much higher. One measure of this comes from United Way. It is called ALICE, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. And you can see in the dark blue those ALICE thresholds as opposed to the official poverty guidelines. For a single adult, it's nearly double, and for a family of 4 would need 2.5 times the official poverty guideline in order to be able to make ends meet without any help. This is what we think of as self-sufficiency or economic independence levels of income. Thousands of people in Stark County are struggling right now, and some of these issues are truly life and death. Almost 2/3 of the calls to United Way's 211 helpline every year in Stark County are for basic needs. Things like avoiding utility shutoffs, having enough food, avoiding eviction, the really urgent things that people need right now. And this is a place where Stark County really excels. There are dozens, if not hundreds of organizations that are working to address people's immediate needs and help them get ahead in the future. And Stark County has a lot of best practice programs that come to be examined from people all over the state and all over the country wanting to know what's happening here in this community. The problem is that a focus solely on addressing immediate needs means that you can never get to those root causes of the problem. In economic terms, addressing immediate needs is really the demand, the supply. You're supplying the services, which you want to move into the demand side, to have fewer people have a need for hunger assistance, for example. Stark County is also a community that has shown with several recent examples that when organizations come together informed by data to address a difficult community issue, you can have progress very quickly. An excellent example is the progress that has been made on reducing infant mortality and reducing racial disparities in infant mortality, thanks in large part to the Thrive initiative in Stark County. And in fact, when the latest data was released, Stark County had shown more improvement than any other large county in Ohio on infant mortality. And that is thanks to these data-driven efforts that are happening in the community that involve a lot of collaboration and coordination. Another great recent example is all of the work that has happened when a crisis in youth suicides was identified, with agencies from across several different systems coming together to try and address this issue and really save lives within your community. So you have shown that when you as a community come together and collaborate to address a challenging community problem, you can make progress. Poverty exists today, not because there isn't great work happening in your community, because there is. It continues and perpetuates because it is such a difficult thing that has so many tentacles that lots of different solutions need to happen all at the same time in order to make significant progress on child poverty. On the next slide, we see the bridge between addressing immediate need and breaking the cycles of poverty, and that comes with increasing the earnings of families. No one chooses to be poor. There is a myth about the lazy poor, people who don't want to work and sit at home, biding their time. But the data shows just the opposite. In Stark County, more than 15,000 poor adults worked at least part of the time for at least part of the year, and nearly 4,000 people worked full-time for the whole year and still didn't earn enough to be above poverty. About 45% of people over age 16 living in poverty in Stark County worked at least part-time in 2018. Part of the reason for this is that people just aren't earning enough, even if they are working. So Ohio's minimum wage of $8.70 an hour means that someone working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, would earn a little over $18,000. That's below that poverty threshold for a family of 3. And that family would need to earn at least $10.25 an hour in order to be above poverty. And to reach those self-sufficiency levels, they probably need to earn closer to $30 an hour. So a big gap between minimum wage and what a family really needs in order to get by. I looked up just this morning the listings for jobs on Ohio Means Jobs, which is sort of the clearinghouse for job postings in Ohio. And of the more than 11,000 current job openings within 20 miles of Canton right now, 57% pay less than $50,000 a year. And if you'll recall, that ALICE threshold for a family of 4 was $66,000 a year. Some of the places that have been targeted for economic development and growth are jobs in retail and tourism. This, of course, was before the pandemic. Those are areas that often and traditionally have had low wages. And so the community will always be in a stressed position unless we can figure out how to get more money in the pockets of workers within the community. Now, of course, the pandemic has made many of these things worse. And we really talked a lot about what needed to change in our report in order to reflect the current conditions right now. What we decided is that child poverty has been a persistent problem. It is not going away and may be getting worse because of the current conditions. The next slide shows some updated data, which is the unemployment rate for Stark County over time, going back 30 years to 1990. This was produced by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. You can barely see it, but on this chart are light gray lines that indicate when recessions happened. What I'd like to point out is that historically, unemployment in Stark County has peaked after the recession has ended, so that the recovery takes a lot more time in communities across Ohio than it does in other places in the country. And also, you'll see that big spike that happened in 2009 and 2010 following the Great Recession. So your communities were hit particularly hard by unemployment in the Great Recession. And there at the end, of course, is what happened earlier this year. Between February and April, unemployment rate in Stark County tripled. It still remains almost double what it was a year ago. The latest data shows unemployment in Stark County at 7.8%. So the pandemic certainly plays a role. What we're seeing is that people in higher earning jobs, higher paying jobs, they're tending to be insulated from some of this economic upheaval caused by COVID-19. And we're also noticing that there seems to be a disproportionate impact on women, and especially on working mothers, many of whom are taking themselves out of the labor force in order to provide childcare, to take care of their kids when their kids are doing virtual learning, and have lost the kind of childcare that they relied on in order to be able to maintain their employment. This issue of working parents and child poverty is just inextricably intertwined. The next slide shows that more than 3/4 of families with children living below poverty in Stark County are headed by a single parent. And single mother families are more common than single father families in Stark County. So the poverty rate for all families is about 16%. So it's a little bit higher than the poverty rate for all people. But it's less than 5% for married couple families and more than 40% for single female households with no spouse present. These are families with children. That tells us that single mother families are about 8 times as likely as married couple families with children in Stark County to be living below poverty. It is hard to be a single parent. There's no other earner, and there's no other adult to share the household responsibilities. But one thing that we think is playing a role in this disparity are wage gaps, which are shown on the next slide. Black women in Stark County on average earn about 54 cents of every dollar earned by non-Hispanic white men. And for Latino women, it's even worse. This chart shows the annual average earnings of full-time workers in Stark County. Now, of course, the particular industries that they work in or the jobs that people are doing certainly plays a role in those average earnings. But the Fund for Our Economic Future found that non-white earners are earning about 30% of what their white peers are earning, even if they're working in the same occupations. So pretty serious wage gaps that we're seeing in Stark County and across the region. Both race and place play a role. Decades of population loss has hollowed out communities in Stark County and across Northeast Ohio. This has concentrated poverty, it leaves a smaller tax base, and it has accelerated community disinvestment. And neighborhoods, unfortunately, have deteriorated while racial disparities have sharpened. The next map shows, or the next slide shows a map of the poverty rate in Stark County by census tract. The darker areas are the places that have higher poverty, and you can see a strong concentration in some of the cities, Massillon, Alliance, and Canton within Stark County. And then other areas that are also, have a lot of people living in poverty. Every community in Stark County has at least some people who are living in poverty, but of course that's not spread evenly. And what research shows time and time again is that the same neighborhood amenities that attract wealthier families are also solutions to break cycles of poverty and poor health. These are things like access to high quality education, access to parks and recreation opportunities, walkability and access to jobs and to good health care. People who live in quality neighborhoods have access to safe housing, recreation, good schools, low crime, and they are often surrounded by supportive neighbors. So what has happened in Stark County over the last several decades is that poverty has really become concentrated in a few key places. And so focusing in on some of those places can help your community very quickly address some child poverty issues. So I want you to kind of take a look at that map that you see on your screen and keep it in your mind as we go through the next series of slides, because you'll begin to notice a geographic pattern. The next slide shows a portion of the Ohio Opportunity Index that was released earlier this year as a collaboration between the state of Ohio and the Ohio State University. It can be found actually on their COVID dashboard because so many of these issues are the social determinants of health and have been found to put people at higher risk for COVID-19. This map shows the employment index portion of it. Looking at low wage job access by educational attainment, access to workforce or job training sites, and the unemployment rate. So of course, employment is closely tied to poverty, since poverty is really about household income. But when we take a look at the next map, it looks largely the same. Again, those areas, if we can go to the next slide, those areas that are darkest, were darkest on the poverty map, are darkest here in the health index map, where they're taking into consideration things like preterm birth, mortality rates, emergency department visits, diabetes, and drug addiction. So where you live has a profound impact on your wealth and on your health, especially for children growing up in poor neighborhoods. The next slide shows us that place matters. So my colleague at Community Solutions, Kate Warren, did some great work last year looking at the correlations between life expectancy and several other issues. And she found a stronger correlation between life expectancy and birth and poverty rate than between race and life expectancy at birth. So poverty plays a really critical role in something as important as how long someone can expect to live. In Stark County, less than 4 miles means a difference of over 16 years in life expectancy between a neighborhood on the east side of Canton and one near the center of North Canton. Where you grow up and where you live has been shown to be correlated with health, social, and economic outcomes, including employment, chronic disease, kindergarten readiness, and lead poisoning. So living in poverty can actually shorten your life. And I can't think of something that is more important to address than that. So I've thrown a lot of data at you. There is more in the white paper itself, and we talk a little bit more about the implications of these things. But we also lay out a path forward and some recommendations that I want to quickly run through. The first is on the next slide, is that organizations should coordinate the planning and implementation of well-defined projects and activities toward a comprehensive child poverty reduction plan for Stark County with a specific neighborhood level focus. So this is about getting together, coordinating efforts. It could look like a quarterback. It could look like something else. The next recommendation is that child poverty reduction plans for Stark County should consist of addressing immediate needs, looking more heavily toward breaking the cycles of poverty by increasing the earnings of families and promoting activities that integrate financial planning and incorporate neighborhood level strategies, all the things that we've been talking about. The third recommendation is that efforts to reduce child poverty must include work with both children and their families, promote household stability, focus on reducing disparities, and recognize that place matters. The fourth recommendation is that the Stark County community should invest more resources into child poverty reduction and leverage public dollars. Government has a very important role to play in the reduction of poverty and the amelioration of those current pressing issues. You know, programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and Free and Reduced Lunch feed far more children in communities across the country than food banks can ever help to do. Recommendation 5 is that economic development strategies should be targeted to enhance the ability of workers to earn family-sustaining wages regardless of where they live and to close gender and wage gaps. When we close those gaps, the entire community wins. It means more earnings, which means greater taxes, which means less demand for those expensive social services that are addressing immediate needs. And recommendation number 6 is that existing best-in-class programs and agencies should be supported and strengthened to achieve their impact potential, while encouraged to explore new partnerships through collaborative efforts, especially with agencies that are already embedded in communities and neighborhoods. The next slide shows some of the attributes that we recognize that best-in-class programs and agencies have: a willingness to partner, adapting to individual needs of the people they serve, strong collaborations, being deeply embedded in communities and neighborhoods. The issue of trust is very important for best-in-class agencies. Setting clear goals and measuring their results, being innovative, and being data informed and guided by evaluation. Stark County, we came up with a list of dozens of agencies in Stark County that display many of these attributes. And so it is less a matter of building something new and more about bringing things to scale, kind of bringing the resources to bear on this very challenging problem. And that brings us to recommendation number 7, which is the last, but probably the most important one. And that is that all organizations and institutions that care about the future of Stark County need to identify how they will help support and sustain the implementation of a child poverty reduction plan for our community. So with that, I will stop and take questions before we talk more about one way to move forward.
Thank you, Emily. And we do have some questions that have come in. Again, please feel free to type them into the chat box or into the Q&A. I'll ask these questions first to Emily, but also Maria, Mark, if either of you feel like chiming in with your thoughts, especially to this first question, I think, please feel free to do so. So the first question that we received is, what can the average citizen in Stark County do to help this issue?
That is a great question. So there are a couple things that the average citizen can do. You know, the first is to support with your dollars, your hard-earned dollars, those agencies that are making a difference in Stark County. You know, certainly United Way and Stark Community Foundation are always interested in having more resources to be able to grant within the community. And, you know, yesterday was Giving Tuesday, so every nonprofit that many of us have ever interacted with, we're soliciting our donations. You know, so that's one way. A second way is to get involved in a little bit more personal way. So perhaps volunteer, become a mentor, work with those children or those families that are struggling. And I think one of the things that is a really important thing for the average citizen to do is to examine some of your own thoughts about people living in poverty. So, this data about the fact that 45% of adults living in poverty in Stark County are working kind of challenges some of our assumptions and stereotypes. And so starting to recognize some of those challenges that people living in poverty are facing can help us come up with innovative solutions in order to overcome them. I mean, we have all experienced some of the challenges over the last couple of months that people living in poverty experience all the time. Things like childcare that we can't rely on that impacts our ability to get our job done, transportation challenges, not being able to go where we need to go, stores or other things not being open when we are trying to get to them. And so, I hope being a little bit more kind and giving people grace as people try to work through their issues is really a way that the average citizen can help these issues. I want to see if Mark and Maria have other suggestions.
No, Emily, I think you covered it very well. Thank you. I would just reiterate, I think there's opportunities to get involved as a volunteer with organizations that do this work, especially now. There's a lot of challenges going on in the community, and all the agencies are finding creative, different ways to provide services. And if you call one of us, I'm sure we can help you find that perfect niche that meets your interest.
So I would add to that by suggesting that those of you that are interested in getting involved, maybe take an initial self-test and ask yourself, what are you most passionate about? And I can almost guarantee you that there are agencies available here in Stark County that can that are very much aligned with your passions. And as you think about what you're most passionate about, I'd suggest that you could either contact Maria at United Way, or in a moment you'll see contact information for Amy Krebs here at Stark Community Foundation. Contact either one of them, and they can put you in touch with those volunteer agencies, those volunteer opportunities. If there's one thing that we learned through Strengthening Stark is that I mentioned early on, it started out as an initiative and it's rapidly become a movement. And by that, I mean that we have more people engaged in that activity today than we ever imagined when we first issued that white paper. And my hope is that we see the same sort of phenomena here, that people throughout Stark County ask themselves, what are we passionate about and how can we help? And we can certainly get you in contact with those agencies that can use your assistance.
Great, thank you. And we have been getting a lot of questions coming in. Please keep those questions coming. We have some questions surrounding education. Going to ask one of those broadly, what can schools and school foundations do?
Oh, schools play such an important role in this work, and I think we have seen the important role that schools play in much more than just, the core basics of teaching as schools closed during the pandemic. So schools certainly have a huge role to play in this, finding ways to partner with effective community agencies to get children and their families the sort of wraparound services that they need in order to show up every day to school ready to learn and to be able to really take advantage of what schools provide is a very important piece of this. There are lots of innovative things that school foundations are doing in communities across Northeast Ohio and around the country to try and address some of those issues. I think one of the most prominent examples is the work that LeBron James is sponsoring in Akron, where the children that attend that school, it's like the whole family is part of this community. And so there are employment resources and job training available for the parents as well as for the students. And so, figuring out how schools can partner, because schools do a lot. and do much more than educating children. And really, you know, in my personal view, like that's what school leaders are trying to do, is to educate children. And so figuring out ways that we can bring other areas of expertise to bear is so important. So being open to partnering with those high quality community organizations is really key.
Yep. Maria, I'd call on you maybe just to share very briefly some of the great work that care teams are doing in the schools in Stark County, because I think that helps to address this question also.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Care team, for those of you who are not familiar, is a collaborative. You know, we're big on collaboratives in Stark County because they work. It's a collaborative between United Way, the Mental Health Board, Job and Family Services, Family Council, Stark County MRDD, just a group of individuals who provide wraparound services in our local schools. Every single district in Stark County and parts of Carroll have a care team. And the point of care team is to identify students that just need those extra supports to be successful, or their families may need some extra supports. And here's an example. You know, when COVID hit, we reached out to the schools and said, what do we do to make sure that our kiddos and families who are, for instance, food is, you know, schools provide a lot of food to our students. And the schools were able to turn around and become drop-off points. Our care team staff, our family support specialists that are in the schools, are intimately involved with these families, and they reached out even during COVID. Sometimes it was sitting on the front porch with social distancing and just talking and providing supports. It might have been food delivery, prescription assistance, etc. So our schools, as Emily said, really, we're very fortunate here in Stark County that we have the kind of supports we have, and that funders collaborate to make sure those services are available.
Great. And again, we've had more questions coming in. One of them had to do with the data surrounding the ALICE wage, the 66,000. The question is that a national figure? And if it is there a local ALICE wage estimate for Canton?
So
The ALICE
that
report-
is, oh, go ahead, Maria.
Oh, no, please, Emily.
It's Stark County, so that is local data. And please provide more context, Maria. We're so excited we know the answer.
Yes, and if you go onto our website, you can pull down the entire ALICE report. As Emily said, it is Stark County based. It's a report for the whole state of Ohio. And the report on our website, you can drill down even to the neighborhood level in some cases.
And another sort of nuts and bolts question that we had, it was mentioned 57% of listings on Ohio Means Jobs keep people below poverty. Was this looking at income for a family of three? Emily, I think this one's your wheelhouse.
Yep, so that was 57% of the current openings on Ohio Means Jobs pay less than $50,000 a year. So it is above the poverty thresholds, but it's below that ALICE wage for a family, and actually below the median income in Stark County. So the point where half of people earn more and half of the people earn less.
Great. And then another question that we've gotten written by many people in a couple of different ways, slightly different than how can the sort of regular Stark County person be involved. But a lot of people are asking, how can their organizations be involved? Some people are saying that one person's a nonprofit executive of a youth serving organization. Another person is saying, how can my organization be at the table and be involved? What would you all suggest?
Let me begin, and then Emily and Maria can add to my thoughts. One of the tactics that we pursued early on, and when we initially released Strengthening Stark, was that people like Maria and myself and Ray Hexamer and myself went on a speaking tour of Stark County, and we spoke to tens of thousands of people that were brought together in a variety of organizations all across Stark County, just to share the data that was contained in Strengthening Stark and the recommendations that we presented. And we're ready, willing, and able. And I think, Emily, I would go so far as to say we're planning on doing the same kind of speaking tour on this Protecting Stark's Future. So we would make ourselves available to any groups that you're affiliated with that want to hear the details of the story, so that we can make sure that we communicate broadly and thoroughly across the county, so that people begin to understand the issues that we're attempting to deal with here, because the solutions exist within each of us. It's no one person or no one organization that will solve this problem. It's within each of us. And so the more people we can get engaged, the greater success we will have.
Maria, did you want to chime in at all? Or we can move on to one of the other questions that we have.
No, I would agree with Mark. And I think, as Mark shared, our intent is to go out in the community and have conversations. And one of the recommendations is bringing people together to have further dialogue. So this is just the very beginning. And so I encourage anyone who wants to continue to be part of the dialogue or to receive updates, reach out to both our organizations. We'll make sure that contact information is available. As I said, this is just the very beginning of the conversation. And we know, again, how well this community collaborates. And I echo Mark, if we all get on an agenda together, it's just amazing what we can accomplish.
Great. And another question that Emily, I think you may have answered before, may have come up before. Some people are commenting if there's a greater chance of a single parent being in poverty, does that mean that we should reinforce marriage and the nuclear family? I mean, can you comment on that? Can you address that?
Sure. What the data show and what we usually like to talk about is that it's less about the marriage and the official sort of status of the relationship, but the idea of stability is extraordinarily important for children and for families. And so, sometimes, of course, as we all know, we can have good marriages and bad marriages, and, getting out of a bad situation can be the best thing for the family. But the data also show that the number of earners in the family dramatically reduces the likelihood that the children will be living in poverty. I mean, of course, it stands to reason. And so, thinking about what are the ways to improve family stability in a variety of ways. It could be, encouraging marriage, encouraging usually it's fathers to continue to be involved in the lives of their children. Lots and lots of research shows how important that is, especially for young men. And so, this is an area where there's lots and lots of different answers that can come to bear. Part of it may be who's considered to be part of that family. Part of it is probably thinking about why is it difficult for single mothers to maintain their employment or do some of those things, which are issues that go far beyond just Stark County. But, when we start local, we can sometimes identify ways that really work for our neighbors to overcome some of these very difficult challenges.
Great. And I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We do want to give a chance for Amy to discuss next steps and the request for proposals. So I'll try to share the remaining questions with the presenters and see if we can get some answers for those. But again, do want to give Amy some attention right now. Amy, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you so you can talk about the RFP and the next steps.
Great. Well, thank you. And those are great questions. And certainly I know we all look forward to continuing this conversation. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and discuss the funding opportunity that we are making available in response to what we've been talking about today. So if we look at that targets for a child poverty reduction plan, just want to be very clear that the focus of this request for proposals is to address child poverty rates through efforts that increase the earnings of families and break cycles of poverty. So in terms of immediate needs, we absolutely recognize and will continue to support immediate needs as they relate to child poverty. And you can learn more about all of our funding opportunities in terms of Stark Community Foundations on our funding opportunities page. We have several opportunities that you can take a look at. And we also realize that there are a lot more funds available that speak to immediate needs, even outside of philanthropic dollars. So we're certainly mindful of the investments that we're making here in this regard. So as Emily mentioned, I also want to emphasize that all communities in Stark County are invited to participate in this conversation. We invite you to be involved and certainly encourage you to apply for funding and at least be involved in the conversation. We do share the needs in our community with our family of donors. I'm sure the United Way does as well. So it's a great opportunity to share with our donors the information about your organization and your efforts. I'll touch upon a couple of highlights of the RFP. You can access it in its entirety later this week along with this webinar. We'll also have the data assessment, Strengthening Stark, and this report that we're talking about today, all captured on one page so you don't have to go searching for everything. So in terms of the projects that we're looking to fund, the desired projects will noticeably strive to improve a specific neighborhood in Stark County in terms of addressing child poverty. These projects will clearly outline goals and objectives. And again, it's very important that we tie back to the data that we've been talking about here today. And in terms of tying back to data, if you have any data that you come across in our reports and want to learn more or need to break the information down even further, we can help you with that. Obviously, with the Center for Community Solutions, they can provide that greater detail to you. Maria mentioned the United Way has a wealth of information, in particular about ALICE on their website. We have the Stark County Auditor's Office, their GIS system. Strengthening Stark has been having a huge focus on specific neighborhoods, and there are others in our community. So we can help connect you, because the better data that you have and that you're seeking to address, the better informed we are in terms of where our dollars are going and that impact that we're here today to talk about, that we're hopeful to make. So in terms of grants that will be available, there's 2 tracks. The first is a 1-year planning grant up to a maximum of $15,000. And these are projects, hence the name, that seek to support further opportunity to explore a project with the intention of implementing the project. And again, the RFP will go into much greater detail. And once a project has been through the planning stage, we will be offering implementation grants, which is a 1 to 3 years with a maximum award of $100,000. And if you're sitting here listening and you have a project that's about to be implemented or is being implemented as we speak, as long as you can demonstrate that there was a sufficient planning period, we will consider an implementation grant. But again, we can talk about that later on down the road. Certainly, as has been stressed throughout this webinar today, we are encouraging organizations to collaborate with one another. We understand that those can also be challenges, but when it's done effectively, it's to the greater good for all of us. This can be a larger entity and a grassroots organization. This can be 4 larger entities, whatever makes sense for your organization and meeting your organizational goals. So the application itself will open in February of 2021. The timeline will be outlined on our site as well. And as you review the information, by all means, feel free to reach out as you have questions. We have a page that will include, like I mentioned, slides from today's webinar, the reports, and the RFP. And I just want to wrap up by quickly thanking everybody who has been providing feedback on all of this work. It is absolutely appreciated and helps guide what we do. And we take very close notice to all of the feedback that we've been receiving. If you haven't had the opportunity to really let what this information is telling us to sink in, when it does, or if you have any suggestions, by all means, send your thoughts and feedback to us. It helps inform what we do going forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Danny. If there are any other questions, I guess we're right at 11:30 on the dot, but any other questions or comments that we didn't get to, Danny, I think will pass those along to us and we can follow up in the next day or so.
Absolutely. You don't even need me, Amy. You could have just moderated the whole thing.
No.
So as you can see on your screen, if you do want to follow up with Amy specifically with questions about that, the RFP, her information is on the screen right there. And then also here is that link that we mentioned, that a recording of this webinar, the slides, and then more information about that RFP will be available by this Friday at that link that is on your screen right now. So we want to be mindful of everyone's time as it is 11:30, but please feel free to follow up with us with any questions that you may have about the report or about the RFP. And otherwise, thank you all very much for your time today and for joining us. And I will everyone adieu.
Thank you.